The 4th of July is a date steeped in symbolism, an important day for hundreds of millions of people who celebrate a momentous occasion. I'm of course referring to the beginning of the Ottoman siege of Belgrade. It's also the date that the likely outgoing Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, set for the election, and the actual symbolism of picking America's Independence Day for an election that might finally release him and let him flounce off to California to become a tech bro is not lost on me or lots of other people. It's also offered me a delicious opportunity to potentially declare July 4th Independence Day. That is, if we get the larger than expected crop of independents in Parliament that some might think is plausible. Independent candidates may seem like an odd topic to end an election video series on. After all, the UK does not have a great tradition of electing them. Since 1950, the maximum number of independents elected to the UK Parliament was 2 in 1951. To be an independent candidate in a British election is to sign yourself up for, at worst, unending ridicule, thought of alongside Mr. Fishfinger challenging Tim Farron, and at best, irrelevance in a parliament that can afford to ignore you. You can see why very few people are willing to put up the £500 deposit if you decide to expand the definition of independent to include political parties that only have a single MP representing them, effectively acting as an independent just with a partisan affiliation. Then the maximum number rises from 2 to 4. A doubling, and a number that was last reached in 2005. But even then, that's less than 1% of the total number of MPs elected to a given parliament. There is simply no significant political culture of electing independent candidates, especially in Great Britain. A lot of those independents I mentioned, elected since 1950, were elected in the north of Ireland, which has its own political system that we absolutely cannot get into right now, but just understand that it's its own thing. If we average it across that period, the UK Parliament elects 0.65 independent MPs at every general election. That is 0.1% of the Parliament. An independent is elected every other election. If we take our expanded definition, it's 2.15. I cannot emphasize this enough. It just does not happen at a great scale in the UK. So on the surface, I'm kind of talking about something that is such a minor tendency that it doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Like, why? What am I doing? Which is why, if I were to tell you that we could reasonably expect not 1, but potentially 3 or 4 independents to be elected in the general election, you would immediately jump to ask me how and why, and a lot of other questions that I will try and do my best to get to. If we use our expanded definition to include George Galloway of the Workers' Party and Jason Zadrozny of the Ashfield Independents, who I've done videos on, just saying, you can go check those out, we could be looking at between 3 and 6 independents, effective independents, in Parliament, which would be a record. How is this even possible? That's a legitimate question given the evidence base I've just given to you. The last time a significant number of independents and 1 MP parties were elected was 1945, which was such an outlier that I legitimately could not justify including it in that dataset I used to get those averages from. You might also correctly say, that's very cool, SK, but even if it happens the way that you say it will, the independents will still be a tiny portion of MPs. And you're right, so why bother talking about it now? The difference is in what's likely to happen between the 2 major parties. If we take the 2005 election, Labour won 355 seats, which is a decent majority, certainly for them, historically speaking. But there was a large opposition, so the minor parties and the independent MPs faded into the background. This time, depending on whose estimates you take seriously, the upper end of Labour's potential seat count is in the high 490s, possibly the mid 490s at this point. It's not massively out there to suggest that they could get 500 seats. It's very unlikely, but let's imagine that they do a little better than their maximum expectation. That would mean that there would be an opposition that numbers 150 seats. 7 of them will likely be Sinn Féin seats, so it could effectively be as low as 143. That is really small by historic standards. The Labour Party alone in 2019 won 202 seats, and that was considered a catastrophically bad result. The Tories in their 1997 annihilation won 165. I cannot stress this enough, how small the parliamentary opposition could be after this election. Now, I'm not saying that this is likely, as I've already said, or even that a significant number of independents and effective independents will be elected. It is, after all, very difficult, and they're up against very effective political machines, and it's just hard. It's hard, okay? It's difficult. First past the post and a lot of other things just make it very difficult. But let's suppose we ended up with 3 or 4 independents because of the diminished size of the opposition and the way that time is divided up between government and opposition in Parliament. You could see them take on a larger role than they otherwise would, despite the huge Labour majority. That's why I think talking about them is important, but it's also naturally very difficult to talk about independent candidates as a united force, because by definition, they can't be. That being said, insofar as we can act as if there's a trend here that's led to this opening for them, what are the likely causes going to be if we end up with more independents in Parliament than ever before? For one, as I mentioned in previous videos, there has been a general trend of decline in the vote shares of both major parties. In fact, according to some of the poll trackers, the combined Labour-Conservative support will be at its lowest level since World War I. The typical beneficiaries of this, however, are various forms of protest party. The Liberal Democrats used to occupy this role. UKIP did very well in 2015 on this basis. The SNP, though that is more complicated than mere protest, they also had massive success occupying this space. And as I said in my last video, there's an aspirant for this position in the Greens. Independents do not tend to do well in general, but they seem to particularly struggle when a lot of support has coalesced around one of the major parties. Landslides just have a way of bringing everyone on board because people like the feeling of winning. And I don't blame them for this, by the way. But this is why some countries ban polling right before an election. All that being said, as much as first past the post is a majoritarian system, it's also a system that allows some very, very weird things to happen, especially if there's more than 2 parties that are electorally viable. As long as there's sort of reasonably sized constituencies, there's low turnout, and if we're in a situation where one major party has completely evaporated, then strange things can start happening. There is a portion of the electorate for whom it's not just the 2 big parties who are discredited, but they're aspiring alternatives. For example, one might think that the Lib Dems are to be condemned forever for their role in austerity inflicted on the country with their approval, and for my ever-expanding student loan debt. You might also think that the Greens have handled, for example, transphobia in their ranks poorly, or that Reform are just... well, they're Reform. There's no redeeming feature there whatsoever. We have a completely discredited party political system, so the obvious thing to do is to look outside of partisan candidates. And I'm not saying that's where most people are going, just that there is clearly some specific demand for it. Candidates who are taking these things seriously, as the independents who I want to talk about, at least largely, are, they're not inducing demand. They're usually responding to some kind of demand that exists already. Maybe not enough of it exists for them to win, but there's enough to convince them that it is worth a punt. Another interesting component of this is just how many of the notable independents were relatively high members of an established political party. One thing I highlighted in my last video was that as a party gets larger, it inevitably faces issues with coherence. Just because more people means more opinions means more factionalism. It doesn't have to be toxic, right? But both of the main parties have had issues where I think it's hard to argue that it's just, simple political disagreements, right? It's clearly gone beyond that. Actually, I was talking to a fellow YouTuber, Legal Kimchi, who you should check out, about this in a conversation that was ostensibly about making the presentation for the videos better. Coming soon TM, by the way. That's what that box there, those two boxes there, which I just bumped the camera for, those two boxes there contain things that will be related to the videos soon. But we were talking about the American political parties and how incoherent they've become because of how large their electoral coalitions have to be and the pressures put on them due to first past the post to be broad. And in the UK, we behave badly in first past the post terms. Oh yeah, that's right, we're the bad boys of majoritarian democracies. I hated doing that. I hated doing that. And yet the variety of parties that have come to pick at the electoral coalitions of the major parties just aren't enough. Part of this is because those parties are, as I've said, discredited in some way or another, and just sometimes people just don't like them, which is entirely fair. You're entitled not to like things. This is partly why this group of independents feels different, at least the broadly left of centre ones. This isn't Mr. Fishfinger or a local businessman reckoning they can have a decent go at being an MP, like in the Rochdale by-election, or a YouTuber running a prank. And yes, this has happened and is happening at this election. A YouTuber is running apparently as a prank candidate, and for once it's not me doing something weird and dodgy, but it is happening. They represent various ruptures between public opinion and a part of the political class. Whether that's enough for them to win or to be credible electoral threats, we'll see. It's hard to win as an independent, as we know, but it does give them a little bit more about them, something that could galvanize people. There's also the simple fact that this set of independent campaigns have been very motivated in some cases, and also have some very well-known people as their candidates. This is a good time to speak about some interesting types of candidates and where their various breaking points may have been. I just want to say that just because I mention an independent candidate by name, that does not mean I endorse them or that you should necessarily vote for them. They are just what I think are interesting examples of the things I'm talking about. And like I've said, independents are basically impossible to talk about as a coherent block, so there will be no blanket just vote for independents, right? Because there's all sorts of weirdos running as independents. Who knows? So yeah, just because Mr. Fishfinger might be running doesn't mean I think you should vote for him. Although realistically, could Mr. Fishfinger be much worse than a lot of the MPs that are probably going to be in the parliament? I don't know, it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough. I would regret it if I didn't point out that there are all sorts of breaking points that have occurred over the last parliament for certain people across all of the political parties. Some more justified than others, but I don't want you to come away with the idea that this is just a left-wing independence thing, or indeed left-wing minor parties, or whatever, that are running. There's a full spectrum of people who I have some sort of feeling of like, I don't understand why you're bothering beyond personal spite, which I do respect in specific cases, and just kind of think this is a path to making an ass of yourself in front of others. One such breaking point in a party was the removal of Boris Johnson as Tory leader and his replacement with Liz Truss. A lot of people put the particular shattering at Liz Truss becoming leader. After all, she was a statistical marvel. Honestly, I kind of love Liz Truss in the same way that I imagine an astrophysicist loves black holes. There's just something so compelling about how extreme of a fuck up she was. Anyway, I did a whole video about that. You should check that out if you want to laugh. Just a bit of comic relief before the election. But she was so egregious that a former Tory in her constituency is going to stand against her, and also had the label Turnip Taliban, which might be one of the funniest nicknames for a conservative I have ever heard. But also, he's running because, and I know this is going to shock you all to hear this, Liz Truss is apparently not a very good local MP. And a lot of local Tory members tried to vote against her becoming the candidate in 2010 when she was first the candidate. Look, is it on the nose that if they're not being scooped up by reform, that the Tory splinters are people who literally live in a manor house and have the title High Sheriff, like he's afraid of Robin Hood, and that he's going to come out of the local forest and win his archery contest? Yeah, it's a little bit on the nose, right? actually, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really know a lot about the Robin Hood myth, despite living in the city where a lot of that happens. I don't know if he does that. That's more of a Crusader Kings thing that I've just said. I don't know if that's real. If that's real, tell me, please. There's also the legend himself, Rob Roberts. Look, I mostly bring him up because I like saying his name, but him and Julian Knight are both former Tory MPs running against the Tories as independents, despite the circumstances of their removal from those parties looking pretty justified, if you ask me. Well, Rob Roberts was kind of offered to get back into the party, but he just sort of didn't go back in. But you get my point. Sometimes independent candidates don't deserve ridicule, but to be ignored and to enjoy their fate of winning 700 to 800 votes. You know, like Simon Danczuk did that one time. There's also a candidate in yeah, look, I'm just gonna call this the Western Isles. A former SNP MP who is the incumbent independent, who actually it turns out might have a fair shot at winning the seat. I mean, that whole part of the UK is just like completely opaque to me. I can only assume they pick the MP by who sacrifices the most goats to some long forgotten deity rather than putting ballots into a box. But he's basically in the same boat as those Tories I mentioned. A guy with a record of behaviour that will be on the screen right now that makes me think, yeah, maybe the SNP are a little better off without him than with him inside the party. And this one is a throwback, and he's technically not an independent. But he is interesting enough that I have to bring him up. He is running under the banner of One Leicester. It's Keith Vaz. It's almost charming that he thinks he has enough political purchase to mount a challenge, but also kind of an interesting reminder that while Luke Akehurst can be a candidate for Labour, there are some people who just can't be Labour candidates anymore. But it's not these people who have really taken my interest. It's the left-wing ones, because I'm on the left, so I'm interested in left-wing ones. In the absence of a reform-like party to scoop up all these disaffected people, and with the Greens seemingly just not in a position to do that just yet, there's an awful lot of frustration that doesn't necessarily have an easy place to go to. Now, this is a dynamic that leads to a lot of people to talk about the idea of a UKIP/reform of the left, which in principle, I get it, but in reality, there's an awful lot of things that make that not strictly feasible. What that means is a lot of people who would probably have made up such a party, if it existed, have either decided to quietly hide within Labour, waiting for their moment to strike, which is, look, it's not what I do. I think that's a dead end. That's why I'm not in Labour, right? Others have decided it's time to look at these rupture points and just run on them and see what happens. The big rupture point is something I'm sure if you've watched all the election videos, you're sick of hearing about it, right? It's Palestine. Now, there was a brief moment during the initial phase of the latest escalation where some people, largely Muslim people, in Britain went searching for candidates who would support their position on Palestine. The press reaction to this was to act as if something illegitimate was happening, to which I would say that you may not like it, but these people are voters in Britain, and they have the right to organise candidates that represent their views at general elections. Do I think that politics becoming sectional is necessarily good? No, but the solution is to demonstrate good political instincts to prevent it from becoming sectional and to just admit when you're wrong. Just as the Southern planters could probably have prevented the American Civil War by just not doing slavery, the Labour Party and other parties could have avoided Palestine becoming a catalyst for dissatisfaction towards them by not supporting genocide. Controversial these days to say this, but there it is. I know there's more at play there, but that really is the long and short of what's caused this, and I don't want you to misunderstand this. Palestine is not a significant issue on the minds of the British electorate, and yes, that includes British Muslims. Now, that's not a condemnation, it's not a commentary, it's just an observation. What it is an insight into the instincts of various political parties and their leaders. And while it may not be in your top 5 issues, people do tend to take a strong opinion on, is genocide good or bad? Usually on the side of it being bad, by the way. So if you find yourself at odds with the political party you voted for historically, it does make you think, What else don't they agree with me on? And that's where candidates like Lian Mohammed or Ahmed Yaqub come from. It's entirely possible that neither will win their seats, and my opinion of both is actually rather different. I have a rather negative opinion of Ahmed Yaqub and a rather positive one of Lian Mohammed. But their key disagreements with the major party of the left of centre originate in Palestine, and them having broadly the better position has allowed them something you don't usually get as an independent candidate, which is a hearing. To the point that Ahmed Yaqub made overturn one of the largest majorities in the country after his 11.7% performance in the West Midlands mayoral election, which, by the way, is a really good result for an independent. I can't emphasize enough how great a performance that is. It's not likely, and history is against him, and it's against Lian Mohammed. But the fact there seems to be real determined attempts that maybe are gaining a little bit of purchase feels a bit different. There's also what I would call senior ex-Labour types running. You see, meaning no disrespect to those other two, but random people deciding to take a punt on an independent candidacy, it happens. On its own, even with an issue like Gaza as a catalyst, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Instead, we also have a variety of ex-Labour MPs and high-profile ex-Labour candidates and ex-Labour people who have clout within the party deciding to take on their previous party. Their specific politics and backgrounds vary to some extent. I mean, we've already mentioned Keith Vaz, who falls into this category, and he's his own fucking thing on another planet at this point. It'd take its own video, and I'm not doing it. After this, I am done with the election stuff. The two I'd focus on are Faiza Shaheen, who I talked about in my video on Keir Starmer, and Emma Dent-Code, both running in part because the party's leadership has either disowned them or is just way too racist for them to deal with. Regardless of your personal feelings, ex-MPs and former high-profile candidates lend a little something to the idea that some kind of thing, event, whatever you want to call it, is going on. Often the biggest barrier to independent candidates is name recognition. And these two most likely have it to a more significant degree than other independents. I also do need to be cautious because while it's tempting to look for patterns and commonalities, independent MPs are, by definition, very particular candidates. So understand that I am glossing over a number of factors that may have led to them running. Above all of these things I've mentioned, you have to assume someone who is this committed to running as an independent is doing it out of some sense of service, which handily brings us to the star of the show in terms of independence. I have to talk about this person because there's really no way around him. Jeremy Corbyn, if you live in the UK, you've heard of him. He was the media protagonist for the best part of a decade. He was the leader of the Labour Party. He's now running as an independent against his old party, trying to overturn a majority that he himself built. That is extraordinary. Even without the context or information, you get the sense that something dramatic has happened here. It has, but it's a drama that has unfolded over a decade. A section of a YouTube video couldn't really explain what level of symbol this guy has become, both positive and negative. To some, he's the last honest man in a dishonest institution, a dedicated servant to his constituents who, by some cosmic accident, went on to become the leader of the main opposition and experienced one of the most, frankly, detached from reality moral panics of all time directed at him. To others, he is the embodiment of the worst excesses of the populist wave of the 2010s, a lightweight, a career rebel, who wilted under the spotlight because ultimately he had nothing of substance to offer and was too personally flawed to be taken seriously as a credible leader. For me, he's more that first description than the second, and I don't think that will surprise you if you've watched the channel for a while. In a way, what happens to him is more deterministic of where all of this independent energy goes than anything else. If he wins, perhaps alongside a few others, then there's a lot of interesting possibilities that could emerge. If he loses, he's liberated from Parliament, and in some ways, we're liberated too. Actually, those of us on the British left, we will be liberated as well. The British left will no longer have to exist in his shadow, a shadow that I think he is embarrassed to cast. Ever the humble man, the reluctant hero, it took a lot for him to even throw his hat into the ring. Frankly, I think he should have done it sooner, but he did it when he did. There's no use crying about it. That's just how the cookie crumbled. Over 3 years of hoping and waiting for the Labour Party to take him back, and this is my speculation, the reason why he waited this time is he still sees the Labour Party as a potential vehicle for societal change, which is wonderfully romantic. But I can't really blame him for this, even if I think it's just like a naive romanticism. He's been in that party forever, possibly literally forever. It must be difficult to have to leave and then articulate the flaws in that organisation in order to retain your presence in Parliament. And I want to set aside how you might feel about him and how I feel about him, just for a little bit. I want us to think about him in abstract terms. One of the most well-known politicians in the country is running against the party he used to lead as an independent. That is fucking bizarre, right? I went looking and looking, and I couldn't really find a perfect analogue for it. Ramsay MacDonald formed National Labour to remain in an austerity coalition that had more Tories in its cabinet than Labour. That is the closest I could find, and that was back in the 30s. What's happening in Islington North is without precedent, in a totally non-exaggerated way, starting from scratch to overturn a majority held by the party he used to lead that was his majority. It's just so odd. There's something so odd about it. It's an unusual situation, and we got here partially because the coalitions in the two major parties had become too broad, had become too toxic, and because of a lot of petty spite. He also can't be divorced from the issue of Palestine, given how animated people got about his opinions on that, and the various other issues that come up alongside that. Labour are offering a programme of nothing. More efficient racism, more efficient transphobia, more efficient ableism. It stands in stark contrast to what the party offered when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader. Whether he likes it or not, for the rest of his political career, he's going to be some kind of leading figure, whether he's in Parliament or not. The result in Islington North will not change the basic fact of this election. The Labour Party is on course to win a huge majority, but it might just change a few other things. It's funny, because I started this video series, and just in general on YouTube, I am reluctant to tell you what to do. And now I'm going to do it for the second time. I'm going to confidently tell you what you should do. If you live in Islington North and you somehow stumbled upon this video, vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Keir Starmer made a point in the final two-leader debate. If you want change, vote for it. And that's a partial answer. Yes, vote for it. Vote for Jeremy Corbyn, who is a change candidate. But also, if you live nearby or in Islington North, campaign for it too. On the surface, the question in Islington North is, who should be your MP? And that does matter. A little below the surface, and the question is actually, are regular people legitimate political actors, and can political parties treat its supporters, its senior members, its voters like scum? Now, this is controversial perhaps, but I do think regular people can and should be active participants in politics and political actors, and I don't think parties should be allowed to get away with disempowering communities and treating people like scum, which is what they have done in Islington North. And across the country, it's just that it's particularly high profile there. Honestly, my message is this: if you want to send any kind of signal that this is unacceptable, the way that he's been treated, the way that the left has been treated, the way the general public has been treated, by the way, not just the left, the general public has been treated by Labour, go campaign for him or for any good independent that's near where you are. While I think in some ways it might actually not be the worst thing in the world for him to not be in Parliament anymore, I do think in the context of the UK and where this could go, it would be worse for all of us if he wasn't there. And I do want to share a little anecdote with you all. In 2019, I was a young fool, a child of 25, and I campaigned for Labour in Broxtowe for a candidate called Greg Marshall. And if Greg is watching this, it's not impossible. I hope you're well, and I'm sorry Labour stitched you up and replaced you with some random knob job from London as the candidate. That sucks, man. And I went out every spare day that I could as an unemployed 25-year-old who, let's be honest, suffered from depression and probably had a drinking problem and a lot of other problems, but we don't. There's another video. We'll talk about that in another video. And I don't regret putting my shoulder to the wheel despite the result. It was a bad result nationally, and it wasn't a great one locally. It may have been that the slope was too steep and that there was just too much arrayed against potential success. But I don't regret it. What I would have regretted, especially in the context of that result, I would have regretted not trying. So if you are able, in some fashion, please do find your local independent, a good one, a left-wing one, and just help out a bit in the final week of the election. I will link to the big man Jeremy Corbyn's campaign down below. There's lots of ways you can get involved, but have a look around. You never know. If they do surprisingly well, they may find other places that could use them and other levels of electoral politics where they could have a better chance of winning. So don't leave yourself wondering, what if? Fucking go for it if you can. That's, I guess, the message I wanted to convey here. Just fucking go for it if you can. Where am I going with this? Not necessarily anywhere fast. I think there are some clear breakages that have happened on the left, but that we lack an obvious vehicle for those pieces to be picked up in. Sure, Galloway has his Workers' Party, but that's not where it's going, and it's not going there for a good reason in some cases. If we were to get this unexpectedly large set of independent MPs, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe more, who knows, right? In the context of a diminished opposition, you have a lot of opportunities, especially with a dominant party that will inevitably disappoint people. Even though they're promising nothing, they will somehow deliver less than nothing, I promise you that. And I'm not saying that they'll form some kind of new party or that this is a path without difficulty and that we'll have like 70 independent MPs and it's all going to be ridiculous chaos from there. But it is possible that some kind of alternative formation could be built. Maybe it's not especially likely, maybe it depends on something even less likely happening first. It could be that no independents are elected on July 4th, in which case this video is just pissing in the wind. It's make-believe, it's nonsense, right? It just seems like the more serious energy behind this is coalescing behind some common values and common antipathies. It'd be interesting to see where that could lead with more than a couple figureheads for that. So that's it really. Vote for your local left-wing independent if you've got one. Otherwise, if you're like me and you lack it, you're probably spoiling your ballot. And that's it. That's the election videos done. God, that's a long mini series of videos done. I need to thank my proofreader who has read every single one of these scripts. She is my partner. I really, really appreciate her for doing this for me. Reading the unending nonsense that comes out of your partner's head must wear thin after a while, but it hasn't yet apparently for her. I am trying my best here. But I also need to thank Emma for the excellent thumbnail. Please, if you are able, if you have art needs, go check out Emma. Go drop him a message. Get some art made. You deserve it, You deserve some nice art. But speaking of people who deserve nice things, I want to shout out the patrons, particularly the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, and John N. They are the top tier patrons, so they get a shout out. But all of the patrons are so wonderful and so generous. And if you want to get early access to videos, to vote on the topic of the videos, to get access to the super secret parts of the Discord, where I tell all of my dirty, dirty little secrets, then join the Patreon, patreon.com/SKTheCrusader. And I also need to shout out our YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa and Katie Marshall. You can also get pretty much all of those benefits through YouTube membership as well. So, go join that or join the other one. That's all I'll say. And also, if you can't join either of those or you don't want to, like and subscribe. Those are free and those are actually really helpful to the channel. So thank you everyone for sticking with me through this election mini-series. I really appreciate it. And for the last time in a little while, because I'm going to take a small break, thank you so much everyone, and I will catch you on the next one. Take it easy, folks. Peace.